Us off. First of all, thank you all so much for joining Apolitical April, a conversation with Joy Bonaguro. She's the Chief Data Officer of San Francisco, and a few months ago, she wrote a piece on why policy replication is a flawed goal and why we should instead praise process replication. And in response to some member feedback, we wanted to bring Joy here to speak a little bit about her experience and then open a conversation to hear what you're working on and how this concept can apply to your work. But with that, Joy, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Or it's morning for me. I don't know what time of day it is for everybody else, but it's first thing in the morning. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Is there anyone who can't? And if you can't, it's not the end of the world. Okay, I'm not hearing anyone. So, and also sound check, can you hear me okay? I have a bit of a cold, so I'm a little foggy, but all right, hearing no bad things. So again, my name is Joy Bonaguro. I'm the Chief Data Officer of San Francisco, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how I think about replication, in particular in the public sector, but I think it applies in general. So as was mentioned, a few months ago, or I guess it was a few months ago, wow, time flies, I wrote this article somewhat in a bit of a fix because I had recently gone to a conference where everyone was complaining that projects weren't being replicated. And there was a whole section on like, why aren't we doing more replication? And in a particular example that was cited that I mentioned in the article was that, and this was a civic tech conference, was that people were complaining that, you know, the US Digital Services had put together sort of a digital playbook, but then so did 18F, which is another sort of group doing digital work at the federal level. And everyone's like, why didn't they just copy each other's? And I was pretty much the only one in the room who was pointing out that that was a bad idea. And I'll explain why momentarily. And then also recently at the same time was getting frustrated because a funder had given dollars into a group and was very upset that we hadn't replicated projects across jurisdictions. And I was like, yeah, we all looked at that, but replicating projects just kept on not working. And so I really sat down and tried to think about this. And so the article highlights a few things, which is that also at the same time, while we struggled with project replication, we've had many jurisdictions have used various processes. So this is a screenshot of Data SF. So our mission is to empower use of data within the city and county of San Francisco, but also outside of the city and county. And one of the things we do is we take the time to document how we do things in San Francisco. So all of our processes, when they get to a mature enough point, end up in our resource library as a resource collection. And many jurisdictions have told us, oh, we've relied on these so much. It really helped us think about how to approach this. And of course, we made changes, but this really gave us a nucleus. And here's a screenshot of our showcase. Almost none of those people have been like, Joy, we replicated your project on data science or any other number of projects. They were always talking about how they replicated our processes, and over again, their questions to us were about processes that we had done, and then they would go ahead and adapt them. And I think what project replication ignores is these sort of fundamental reasons. With project replication, you're sort of copying a done product, right? So it's like, here, just copy this product. We already know what to do. So the problems with it is it ignores the role of organizational learning. If you're actually trying to propagate what works, that means your jurisdiction has to go through a learning process so they internalize and institutionalize those lessons and that piece. It also completely ignores the concept of sustainability and the power of local ownership. So I keep a little sign in my workspace that says, people don't do what they don't own. So early in my career, someone said that to me, and without fail, every time I try to take something and shove it down people's throat, fully baked, they react in a way that is more or less go to hell joy, you know, and I sometimes forget this lesson, and I always have to remember this lesson. And so the difference between projects and processes, I think, is that of course you can't adapt a process whole scale, right? You have to adapt. You're like, oh, these are things we would change, that wouldn't work here. And whereas projects feel less adaptable, I'm not saying they're not adaptable, but if you present something as, oh, we should just copy what these people do, most people are going to be like, whatever, that's not interesting. The last sort of thing that project replication ignores is needs, priorities, and context. And I have seen this come over in the realm of data science over and over again. People are like, how come everyone isn't just copying the rat model in Chicago in terms of like predicting where rats are? And I'm always like, well, we don't have a rat problem. Or people are like, why aren't you, doing the fire alarm model that New Orleans did? I was like, because we have a different regulatory environment for fire alarms. So it's just this like, people want to pretend that you can sort of just replicate data science projects. And so it ignores needs, priorities, context, and also, even is the data right or the regulatory piece. So this has just become very frustrating for me, and I really want funders to start thinking about this differently, because they think it's wasteful to sort of not copy things. And I think it's really ignorant around what organizational learning is actually about. So let's just talk about some quick examples of process replication. So NOLA has a program called NOLA Analytics that also, like us, is trying to introduce data science and advanced analytics to their jurisdiction. They developed a process that they shared with various other cities around how they're trying to help people who aren't usually used to thinking in terms of data science and what data science projects are. They developed this topology process where people, they use these topologies in the language that operational staffs and departments understand, as opposed to talking about, oh, we need a forecasting model, or we're going to do ML on XYZ. So no, we don't use statistical terms. We try to use terms that people understood. And so we more or less copied this process that they developed, and then we modified it locally. We did some user testing and added, we changed some of the language, and we're able to adapt it based on card sorting. But we were basically able to replicate their process and have the same success where we were able to introduce this new service, Data Science SF, and use these sort of processes of soliciting projects and helping people articulate meaningful data science projects. And now we're about to start soliciting our third cohort of data science projects. Meanwhile, I've never replicated one of NOLA's data science projects because they just don't make sense here, or they're not a priority. Another example, just completely inverted. So NOLA had to create a data set inventory, which means sort of inventorying all your data sets. San Francisco, the piece on the left, this was a document I made back in 2014, okay? This was a long time ago. And at the time, no one had done a data set inventory in their jurisdiction. So we sort of had to make this up. And we can talk about change management later. We came up with a process for doing an inventory. So step one, identify data sources. You'll notice in data-driven NOLA, they gave us a nice shout out. We adapted these from City and County of San Francisco and Data SF. In step one, identify data sources. This is a process that people have replicated all around the country. And so it's actually outside of the country even. So process replication these are obviously narrow examples, but demonstrated success, yet we never talk about it. And what can happen though is I think why we limit process replication is because processes usually aren't documented and available in a public way where people can discover it. And so is it's sort of like a capacity building gap across governments. If you want to replicate someone's process, usually you have to reach out to a bunch of people. You have to do a bunch of interviews to understand what they're doing and all of that. So in our field in general, we really need more people who are aggregating. Our team happens to budget time for documentation and documenting our processes as part of the life cycle of each project. That's why we're able to have a resource library. But I am starting to see where this is being done. So Bloomberg Philanthropies has an initiative called What Works Cities, and it's essentially a capacity building function. And that's cool because a lot of funders don't fund capacity building for cities, which is a real shame. And as part of this capacity building function, they fund several technical assistance providers, one of which is GovX. And GovX does a lot of documentation, of what people are doing and how they're doing it, but then trainings and tools and resources. And so you can think of this as filling a gap. Like in government, we don't, for those of us in certain parts of our sectors, like so chief data officers, we don't have trade journals. There's no playbook on how to do most of the stuff that we're doing. So this is starting to fill an important gap. And then another aggregator is really networks of learning. So we're part of the Civic Analytics Network, which is a network of, I've lost track how many CDOs or equivalent CDOs across the country. And hands down, I cited the example of NOLA Analytics. They're also a member of this network. The most important thing we exchange in those environments is different processes and approaches around how to do things. We almost never copy each other's projects, and every time we try to copy each other's projects, there's not a lot of success stories. And people find that frustrating, I guess, but I don't, because going back to the article. Last thing, I noticed in the sort of replicating what works, guiding questions from participants that I'm just looking at it, there are a lot of questions and comments in this document about scaling excellence and change management. So I just wanted to highlight some of my favorite books around these. Moments of Impact is a really fantastic, it's like a book, except it reads more like a toolkit for having important conversations, and so I highly recommend it. Scaling Up Excellence, in part in preparation for this, I got inspired, and I'm literally looking at my library copy right now because I'm rereading it, even though I have a digital Kindle version. I highly recommend Scaling Up Excellence. So I'm not, I wasn't going to spend time talking about these books. Switch is a nice sort of summary of major change management tooling and research. It's like if you want to go deep on change management, it's maybe not the best thing, but it talks about 3 core steps to change management. One, it provides the analogy of the elephant and the rider. And I don't know if any of you have ridden an elephant. I have. They're magical beasts. Make sure you go to a sustainable place. Anyway, they talk about, elephants. If that elephant wants some sugar cane, you little rider up there, you're not going to be able to direct them exactly. So they analogize between the elephant and the rider. The rider is the brain. So when you're trying to do change, you have to convince the mind that it's important, but that's enough. You also have to motivate the elephant. So you have to create an emotional charge. And then the last thing they talk about is shaping the path. So if it's easier to go down a certain path, people are more likely to do that. The last book, Drive, this book, I love this book, and this isn't really exactly about scaling excellence and change management, except it is because it's the people that are going to do this. And this talks about sort of the 3 things that motivate people, which is an opportunity to become excellent at something, autonomy, and then purpose. And so you have to sort of cultivate, micromanaging people will never result in excellence, right? There's a few more books on sort of managing people that I thought about including here, but I didn't. But if you're interested, we can take that offline. And I think that's all I have, so I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Joy. If anyone has any questions or reflections or thoughts in general, please do unmute yourself and share.
Hi, it's Katie here from the Behavioral Insights team. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and it's something that we've been thinking about a lot at the Behavioural Insights team. We've run hundreds of trials and found lots of positive results. But then when we go back and talk to people that ran them, quite often we find that they haven't scaled as far as they could do. And it's something that we're really turning our attention to at the moment. One thing we've been thinking about is how we can scale things up and still allow for people to have their spin on it, but at the same time keeping the fidelity of the intervention. So making sure that it still works, essentially. And it's something that obviously is very important, that if you want to scale your social impact, that you are scaling something that does actually work. So two things really. One is that we are thinking a lot about how do we still measure whilst we scale up? And then secondly, how do we keep the sort of fidelity of the program? So like, how do we keep the core of what works, essentially?
I guess I'll start off a comment, but my understanding is, as everyone knows, I'm not an expert on all of these things, but I mean, I would question what you mean by maintaining fidelity. Do you mean in terms of methodological sort of coherence?
So I think it really depends on what you're scaling. And I think, so for example, one of our projects that we're looking to scale is the idea of sending people text messages before they have a hospital appointment, reminding them of their appointment. And one of the trials we've run and replicated is telling people how much it costs if they miss the appointment. So telling them how much it costs to the NHS in the UK reduces the number of people that don't show up. And so that's something that we'd like to scale. We know that it's happening in a few areas of the UK, but it's definitely not used across the whole of the UK. So that's an example where we do want to keep, like, the cost message specifically that we used was it's £160, but different people write the messages. They might want to write them in different ways. Firstly, how do we make sure that what actually works is kept? So for example, if someone waters down the message and just says it costs the NHS money or it's wasting resources, we don't know if that is going to be as effective, and it might even backfire for some reason.
Well, this is Joy. I mean, one thing I think, so there's a concept, you know, of like doing rapid experiments, right? And so you all might have found one thing that works. So I would consider, you know, the idea that has to exactly stay the same is maybe not the right way to think about it. Maybe the right way to think about it is how to scale the process of A/B testing in a way that they understand the results from the A/B testing, and they might actually come across something that works much better. So you wouldn't want to stifle that innovation. And by like encouraging them to do the A/B testing in new ways and ways that they like doing, they'll come to own that, where they're at a point where, you know, tech companies, they don't stop at one thing that got work. They're constantly A/B testing and refining and refining. And so that to me is actually what you do want to encourage. So then to me, the scaling question becomes how do we deploy an architecture that allows for rapid A/B testing and helps ensure that A/B testing is statistically coherent. And then we let people go to town, because who knows what they'll find, right? Including like, yeah, maybe our thing works for a while, but maybe over time it doesn't work. So I think really thinking about what we're trying to scale, which I would say what you should be trying to scale is not the exact message you found that works, but the desire to do constant iterative experiments with your clients to see if they're evolving and changing. And so how do you support that essential capacity to do that? That's one thought I have. I don't know if other people on the phone have thoughts.
Yeah, just to respond on that, I completely agree, and it's something that we have already been doing for many years, is encouraging the use of testing. I think our frustration is when something works, that it's not spread even within the organization that did the test. But I think one thing we've been reflecting on a lot is what you've been talking about around ownership, and how potentially what we need to do is to get a wider group of people more bought in to the trialing experience, maybe even get people that aren't even involved in the trial to be advisors or in a kind of circle of trust about the trial. And then so if you do get a positive result, those people are primed to want to take up and use the message because they have been involved in some way. So I think that's something we're really thinking about at the moment.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Hi, I have a question. Good to see you again, Sean. My name is Sally Lindsay. I work at the New Orleans Business Alliance. So I'm loving the New Orleans shout outs in this presentation. We serve as the economic development wing for the city. And I work particularly in developing programmatic work for our bio and healthcare related fields. I was curious to learn a little bit more about how human-centered design intersects with your work stream, and any particularly surprising insights you gained about how things translate or don't translate between programmatic work in the cities that you were comparing.
Is that directed at me, Joy, or?
Yes, directed at Joy.
Yeah, so so my background is actually in design. So we're the quote unquote data team for San Francisco, but we think about design all of the time. So, and I think going back to the earlier comment as well, in design, one of the cornerstones of design thinking is crafting deep empathy for, well, sort of anyone involved in the process, right? Not just the end users, but the people who are being involved in building it and developing it. And so we've focused very much on bringing design thinking to everything that we do. So for example, since we already talked about our data science service, so we provide this data science service, and what we do with our data science service is for each project, we develop something called a user and context research plan, where we actually do, and we scale it appropriately depending on the project, but we use traditional design thinking and design methods to really understand the context and the user needs around the data science question. So, we might be developing a model that predicts what is the fair market value, what should a home have been bought at in San Francisco. But we did tons of user context research to understand how do those appraisal process work, what kind of environment are they working in, because also we're deploying a tool. So since I'm still screen sharing, I'll just show this. And so I think design thinking in terms of just driving user adoption, like, putting yourself in each other's shoes and having that empathy is super important. So I'm just pulling up, this is our resource collection for data science SF. And here's our handbook on user and context research. And if you ever pull up, any like design thinking thing, ours is cribbed straight out of that. We just, and it's mostly, focusing on really bringing the users in and understanding what their needs are before you go out and do any modeling. So I think everyone has more room to add in user-centered design.
Sebastian or Benjamin or Jacqueline, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah, this is Sebastian from the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm just wondering, Joy, how do you see the sort of the chief data officers being national governments?
It was very, very hard to hear.
Well, I just meant, how do you see sort of institutions like chief data officers being implemented in national governments?
Oh, as in, is there a position for the CDO at the national level?
Exactly, yes.
And not at an agency or department level?
And not at a city level, so not in the local government.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it depends what you're trying to do. So I think the closest, at least in the US, we have to an example of that was DJ Patil served as the chief data scientist for the US government. And if you ever talk to DJ about that, what he'll say is, it's really about convening conversations, right? And so I think it depends what you're trying to do. I actually have an article called like defining your role as a new CDO. And I think if you're gonna create like actually a national level CDO, it's more or less about data governance probably. So I think an early emerging model of what this might look like is Canada. So Canada, you know, has about, I think 39 or so million people. So it's not a giant country. So it's like the size of California, and they're working, and I think by fall or so, they're actually going to have a national data strategy, and a lot of that has to do with governance and how we're managing data and how we're developing data infrastructure. And so I think they might be an interesting early country level data strategy. I mean, when you think about the United States, for example, oh gosh, we don't even have data strategies at most local levels, much less state. And then the federal is just quite chaotic. I think the other national example that comes to mind is the statistical agencies or agency of, I think the UK. They have a single statistical agency is my understanding, which is a lot smarter than probably our approach in the US, which everyone and their mother has their own separate statistical agency. Though that's not really about data strategy, right? And so I do think Canada's an early model to see what they're doing, and I'm actually a little totally jealous of them right now. So, but I do think fundamentally it's about governance and creating that strategy, and what that strategy and what that governance needs to cover probably depends on what are the highest priority data needs. So that, in that sense, the role of CDO is very much needs to be based, since this is a new role, it needs to be really driven by what the local needs are. And I do have a blog post on that if you're interested. I don't know, do other people know of any national CDOs? Seems like a tough job.
This is Jackie. I'm curious about this national CDO idea because, yeah, I do feel like a lot of what we do here, I'm from New York City, the Parks Department here, and a big part of our pain points around trying to do analytics is around data governance. But it's so hard to get momentum around actual data management. People don't want to invest in it. So I can only imagine, like, I'm working in this like tiny little agency, well, relatively small agency with like a relatively narrow domain. Trying to do this at a national level across all the different program areas actually sounds really daunting. And I'm curious, like, what's their pull? Because we have a pretty strong pull here for proper data governance. Like, can we all be on the same page as to how many playgrounds we have? Please, 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 please. And not have it be like between 400 and 1100. So I'm kind of curious, like, what drives, I'm sorry to try to pick up on that thread, like what drives like big investment in data governance?
So I'm going to jump in. I have like strong opinions about data governance.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in with my 2 cents, and then I'm sure other people have it. First off, I actually hate the term data governance because everyone just thinks like, oh, that means a bunch of rules that aren't adding value. And so we have a phrase at Data SF we call data governance. But what I'm a huge fan of, there's an excellent book. It's called Non-Invasive Data Governance. I forget, well, here, I can probably just pull it up. This is a really great book on how to think about data governance. And I've read and thought a lot about data governance. I think most books on data governance don't do a good job of actually helping you think through what it is. And it talks about all these different lenses of data governance, including that sort of one that you talked about, which is like us agreeing on what our terms mean, essentially, which is sort of like master data management and enterprise data management. And so I definitely recommend this book. Our team has been working on, and we're about to pass a data policy, citywide and countywide data policy. And one of the ways we rely definitely on the approaches in this book around data governance. But again, going back to the user-centered design, the way we approached what we put in the policy was we think a lot about shrinking change. And so the vast majority of the city data policy, we were just codifying things that we had already introduced and were already doing. So what we developed is sort of this strategy of, well, let's just do this. Let's just introduce profiling and these kinds of things. And we won't tell people it's governance, but then now we're codifying it in policy. So when I pitched this, people were like, I was like, guys, we're just codifying existing effort, right? So shrinking the change.
And loving it. Okay.
And making it as easy as possible. And then the new thing that we're introducing that is new, we went through a pretty extensive process with, we were very strategic about the working group we created around making this policy. And then we did a series of surveys and interviews where we were trying to quantify what are the major areas where we need data governance. And we use that data to present to people. This is what you said. This is our maturity level on these sort of aspects of data governance. And these are the biggest pain points. So we came up with a 3-part test, and I'm sure I'll forget one of the parts. But I should write a blog post on this. And so one part is that it's a widely shared pain point.
Yeah.
Right? And so we were able to quantify that with surveys. The second thing is it's something that's appropriate for a policy, right? Not everything is appropriate for a policy. Sometimes it's actually just a service solution. Like people need to hit, some data service to do validation or something. So a widely shared pain point. It's something that is appropriate for policy. And then the third thing is that it's implementable at this time. Like I get the argument policy should be aspirational, but we need to make progress. So what's like the implementable chunk? And that's why you get to update policies on an annual basis. So we worked and did that sort of surveying, and we identified what was the thing where everyone's like, oh my God, this is killing us. We need policy. We need governance around this. And people are not afraid of it. They're looking forward to it. So again, it goes back to like design thinking in change management and not just thinking about this as like a data governance thing and those kinds of problems.
Okay, thanks. That's super helpful.
Joy, there was a question about how can we develop capacity in successful groups and governments to support and coach others, recognizing it can take away from primary job tasks?
Yeah. So we have something called, I would sort of that, and I remember when I read this and the thing, I would argue that that's not taking away from your primary task. That's part of your primary task. Amazing stuff happens when you have strong teams that help each other learn and bring each other along. So actually building each other's capacity and knowledge sharing is part of your core job. So I think that actually you sort of need to just reframe that. So and sort of, I think I briefly mentioned this, we bake in each project that there's essentially documentation so we can accelerate other people's capacity. Another sort of thing that we do, and I don't know that this completely answers the question, is we have something called Data Academy, which is a partnership with our controller's office. And what we do is we essentially, this is a very cheap program to run, but we specifically offer a bunch of classes free to city departments, and we offer them free for a very specific reason, which is in our city, we have some departments that are really wealthy and some that aren't, but we want to lift and level data skills across the city. And what we found is that, people love, and they're all very hands-on training, so they're designed to like really put people and sort of lift up their skills as soon as they walk out. And we maintain that sort of excellence by we do surveying after every course. We tweak the courses based on the feedback that we're getting. And then what we really see happen is our teachers, so our instructors are great. They actually end up cementing their own learning through the process, and they get to be a knowledgeable person that people really like. And what we've most recently added is office hours onto this. So this is actually a really, and this is just an implicit thing that we try to do with everything, is we try to recognize and lift people up. And so when you're sort of like, in government, you're usually sort of an anonymous cog, and now every single one of our instructors gets profiled on the Data SF website, and they can send it to their mom and their dad, and we have like lunch and learns and things like that. There's me, I teach a class, and I need to update my photo, I guess. And so I think like, we don't spend a lot of money on this program, but we use volunteers. And every single teacher unilaterally, or not, I don't know if that's the right word actually, they all agree that like their skills have been buffed up through teaching their classes. So that's like one way to do it. And then again, yeah, the second thing is like, no, it is your responsibility to bring your team, and you're responsible for the collective team. The book I mentioned, Scaling Up Excellence, talks about that quite a bit actually, and how as leaders or managers, you have to not just think about incentives, but the culture of the people you're letting dominate. And I know in government with civil service, that's sometimes a little trickier, but there's still ways to deal with it. So I do recommend that book. There's a great saying, and again, this is a little harder in government, but if you have the right attitude, there's other ways to think about it, is your most important job as a leader is to make sure you have the right people on the bus. And I would argue that that means people who are willing and think of part of their job as building the capacity of others.
Great. And I know another question that was asked was, and it relates to some of your comments at the beginning, but it was, how do you overcome the quote unquote, that doesn't work here argument against collaboration? And how can media, nonprofits, and other associations, third parties, help to make this kind of collaboration happen?
Yeah, so we get a lot of San Francisco is unique, no one's like us, no, of course we can't learn. Honestly, one of my strategies for that has been is to never say this is exactly what we should do or this is what we should copy. So this is a very deliberate strategy when we were introducing the digital services strategy. What we did was we presented case studies of how other jurisdictions had done it. And sort of, we didn't say we should do what these jurisdictions did. We said, here's examples of how they did it. These fit into a spectrum of options about how we could approach this. What's the right approach for San Francisco, right? So again, like, if you tell anybody, oh, just do this goes back to the replication thing. They just sort of look at you like, well, F you haven't bothered to listen to or understand where I'm coming from. You're not listening to what I care about. And so it goes back to that, like, crafting empathy from their position. They have an important point of view that you need to understand. And so it just doesn't work. So I think, like, I would love someone to tell me when it's like worked consistently. So instead of us focusing on that, it's okay for people to adapt. I mean, when you think about, there's been a movement in recent years to even get around the concept of best practices, because there's so many contextual factors around why something works in one place that may affect why it will or won't work in another place. And you just ignore that at your risk. I mean, the reality is we're a very complicated social species, right? And then when you add in organizational history, like if I have one more person tell me that we need to have a citywide stat program, I am just going to scream, because I don't know if you guys know what stat programs are, but we had a miserable experience in San Francisco around a citywide stat program. And the scars from that are still so tangible and real. And it ignores the fact that, yeah, people have citywide stat programs, and on average, they have like less than 20 departments. Our city has over 50 departments because we're also a county. It's like, it doesn't scale. It doesn't make sense. And so I think you ignore those human factors at your peril. And that's why I put drive in there, because I think the people component is really important and should never be underestimated. And again, I think it's the design thinking that helps you tap into that. I don't know, but maybe I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's hard, right?
Katie, do you have a perspective on that, given your work?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Joy, do you want to kind of repeat the question?
Sorry, I was on mute. I forget the exact question, but I think it was like dealing with frankly, the not invented here syndrome, right? So like people are like, we're different. Why would that work here? And I just said, yeah, well, basically, yeah, you should don't go like, this worked here, we got to do it, because like it's like you're priming people to react to no. So
yeah, I think that's something that we've been really thinking about a lot at the behavioral insights team, especially when I think there are definitely instances where the system is different or the people are different, but at the same time, sometimes, like you were saying about the centralized organization having a centralized statistics agency, sometimes it is good for everyone to do the same thing. So something that I often think about is recycling in the UK, where every local authority is allowed to do their own recycling procurement. And that means that you end up with every area doing their recycling differently. So one, you might say you have to put your paper in one thing and you have to mix the next one. And another place will have glass is done differently or different colors. And it's actually quite disruptive because people move around and they don't understand the rules. And also then every processing center has to deal with different ways of doing things. So I think there is this balance between saying everyone's different, like London can't do its recycling the same way as Oxford, and then saying actually maybe there are some core things we can agree on, like the colours of the bins, like whether we do or don't put paper with glass. And so if, for example, in the UK, well, in Wales, they don't allow people to do things differently in each area. And there are differences within Wales. There are cities, there are more rural areas. They've managed to find a way of making it work. It feels like there are instances, like I would say recycling, where it is actually pretty beneficial for everyone to do things quite similarly. And there are good arguments for why they shouldn't, but essentially sometimes you have to overrule those people. And then there are other instances where it really does matter. The situation is really different. And it's trying to unpick when is the right approach. And it's something in the UK anyway, we particularly struggle with recycling. And I think the Wales example shows how it can be done, and actually how they have a much higher recycling rate than the rest of the UK. And potentially it's because of this continuity and the fact that everyone does do it in the same way.
Great. And Joy, so has there been a time in your work where you've seen something that's working elsewhere and have gone from saying, oh, that's interesting to that's directly applicable to me? Like, what has caused that shift in saying that something is applicable to your work?
I risk sound liking a broken record, but I mean, I already gave the example of stealing the topology and the solicitation process on data science projects from NOLA. We also, there's sort of community engagement ideas that we've stolen from other people, like how they worked and approached communities. We have had a handful of project replications, and I wouldn't say it never happens, but I think we've only had one since I've been here. It's never been that. Another example, it just flew away from me. We've since replicated, actually we worked with the behavioral insights team in North America, and we did a training workshop, and we've sort of replicated that training workshop into what we call like mini behavioral sort of jams and sessions with departments that have like a behavioral experiment that they want to do. So so to be a broken record, it's always been like replicating some process or training. And again, that's mostly what everyone has replicated from us as well.
Great. And I'm conscious of the time, but I'd love to use the final 10 minutes to, this is the first time that we've done Apolitical April and these kinds of conversations. And perhaps, Joy, this is an opportunity for you to share the challenges that are on your mind. But what are the next steps that Apolitical could take to support you in this work? And this could be to Joy and anyone else who's on the conversation.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's Katie again from Behavioral Insights team. I find examples really helpful. So I saw your article on Reach Up and the fact that Reach Up has been attempted to be replicated in multiple different countries, but with varying success. I think those kind of articles are really useful just to give examples of where things have and haven't worked and why.
Great. Anyone else?
Yes, it's Sally again. I was just thinking in terms of all of these groups, it's like really interesting that we have the opportunity to be talking with people from around the country who are obviously spearheading really interesting work and are invested in bettering their work. I would love to see from Apolitical some sort of group where we can continue the conversation, maybe something like a NumTots, like a new urbanist memes for transit-oriented teens or something of the equivalent that could be more formalized for the Apolitical audience. But just in terms of people who have taken the time and are invested in being on these conversations, it'd be great to have a space where you could bounce ideas off of one another or share best practices for, all with a grain of salt or this or that. But just creating a space where we can not only like share the resources that have been given to us from this, for instance, like the book recommendations or this or that, but also being able to have a space where we can have a sounding board with other like-minded professionals.
Great. Thanks, Sally. And Joy, I know that you're somewhat new to Apolitical, but it would be great to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, sure. I pulled up this slide again. We need aggregators. It's just the discovery problem is a real problem, like knowing who's done something that you can learn from already. It continues to be a problem. So I think having these forums where you can surface like good examples of things, but it goes part and parcel with, it's not just conversations, it's also sort of having places to go and learn from. I will say, though, that's biased. I'm a reader, in case you can't tell. I love reading about things. So I think to the extent like apolitical, you could partner with some of these people who are trying to scale excellence and by, documentation and capacity building. We don't really get, again, someone just mentioned, maybe within trade specifics, like, transit and things like that, but more broadly, like trying to improve government management. There's also another thing I want to highlight, which is, and this is again more in the data realm, the What Works Cities certification, which is creating like a standard for like what it means to manage things well with data and data governance and things like that. And I don't agree with all the certification pieces, but there are all sort of like activities essentially that you should be doing as a jurisdiction in order to be well managed. So I think more frameworks like that, like what does it mean to be well managed in government? There hasn't been a lot of successful, I think, adapted writing, of like operating in a private sector to a public sector, and there's not as much hands-on tools and sort of management frameworks for that.
Thank you. And anyone else? Or to build off the comment that was made in the last few minutes? Well, Joy, do you have any final thoughts before we let everyone go?
No, I've talked enough, I feel like.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it, Joy and everyone else. I hope some of you have good ends to your day if you're in Europe, and others have good beginnings if you're on the west coast of the US. But we really appreciate it and are delighted to have you on Apolitical.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Thank you.